The fire in the east drawing-room had burned low by the time Lord Ashford Pemberton, Duke of Ravenswood, realized he had been staring at the same page of his ledger for the better part of an hour. The numbers blurred. He closed the book. Outside, the January wind pressed against the leaded windows of Ravenswood Hall, rattling the old glass in its frames, and somewhere in the house, 2 floors above, at the end of the corridor, he did not allow himself to walk at night. A door opened and closed, light footsteps, the particular rhythm he had learned without meaning to, the way a man learns the sound of a clock in a room where he spends all his time. He knew, without looking at the clock on the mantel, that it was 10:30. She always took a book from the upstairs library at 10:30. He had known her schedule for 5 years. He had never once told her so. Ashford set down his pen, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, and reminded himself, as he had reminded himself every day, for the past 3 years with increasing desperation, that Eliza Vane was his ward. She was 20 years old. She was his responsibility, his obligation, the solemn charge her dying father had pressed into his hands at a graveside in the rain, and he was a man of honor. He had been a man of honor for 5 years. It was becoming the most exhausting endeavor of his life. The guardianship had begun simply enough. Lord Vane had been his father's oldest friend, a good man undone by bad luck and worse lungs, and when the consumption finally took him, there had been no one else. Eliza's mother was long dead. There were distant cousins who circled the estate like polite vultures. Ashford had been 26, newly come into his own title, possessed of a large house and a larger sense of duty, and it had seemed the obvious thing to do. She had arrived at Ravenswood Hall on a grey October afternoon, 16 years old, thin with grief, carrying a single trunk and a copy of Virgil she had refused to let the footman take. She had stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the painted ceiling with an expression that was not wonder and was not fear, but something between them. Assessment, he had realized later. She had been deciding whether the house was worth grieving for. He had thought, she will be fine. He had been right. She had been better than fine. She had been. This was the problem. This had always been the problem. Entirely, irrevocably herself. She had reorganized his library within the first month, not asked permission, not suggested, simply appeared one morning with a system she had devised, explained it to him in crisp, logical terms over breakfast, and begun. He had stood in the doorway of his own library watching her climb the rolling ladder in a sensible gray dress, completely unself-conscious, and he had thought, I am in considerable trouble. He had not acted on it. He was not a man who acted on things he should not act on. He had instead built the walls higher, maintained the careful architecture of guardianship, the formal address, the appropriate distance, the deliberate positioning of other people between them at all social occasions. He had hired a companion for her. He had ensured she attended every suitable event the season offered. He had done everything a responsible guardian should do, and nothing a man in love should do. And he had told himself, every night in this very chair, that this was virtue. He was no longer entirely certain it was, because she was going to turn 21 in 6 days, and the guardianship would end, and she had shown no indication whatsoever of leaving. He had assumed she would go. That had been the plan he had constructed without telling her. She would turn 21. Her small inheritance would transfer to her control, and she would go to London, or to Bath, or to the distant cousins who were no longer circling because there was nothing left to circle. She would go, and the distance would be legitimate, and he could breathe again. She had instead 3 weeks ago asked Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, to begin planning the spring garden. Ashford stood abruptly, walked to the window and stared at the dark lawn. He did not know what to do with that. He had spent 5 years knowing exactly what to do: maintain the walls, honor the charge, count the days until the counting would be over. And now the days were almost finished, and the walls were still there, and she was planning the spring garden, and he was standing at a window at 10:30 in the evening, feeling the architecture of 5 years' worth of restraint develop very serious structural concerns. The footsteps passed again in the corridor above, returning to her room. He pressed his forehead briefly to the cold glass. 6 days. The birthday arrived on a Thursday, which seemed insufficient for the occasion. Ashford had instructed Mrs. Hartley to prepare a proper dinner, not a party. Eliza had been clear she wanted no party, but a good dinner with the good china and the candelabra she had always liked, the tall silver ones that threw warm light across the dining room and made the whole room feel like something from a different century. He had ordered flowers from the hothouse. He had not ordered champagne, and then changed his mind and ordered it. She came down the main staircase at 7 o'clock and addressed the color of deep water, blue-green and quietly luminous. And he was standing at the bottom of the stairs because he had told himself he was simply passing through the entrance hall, and he was a liar. She saw him and smiled, not the careful smile she gave at social occasions, the one she had learned to deploy like a shield, the real one, the one that reached her eyes and made them crinkle at the corners, the one he had spent 5 years not cataloguing. "You ordered the tall candelabra," she said. Mrs. Hartley ordered the tall candelabra. "You told Mrs. Hartley to order the tall candelabra." He said nothing. She had always been able to do this, extract the truth, without asking for it directly, simply by naming the obvious thing he had left unsaid. It was one of approximately 47 qualities he had spent 5 years not cataloguing. "Thank you," she said, and came down the last 3 steps, and he offered his arm without thinking, the way he always had at formal occasions, the practiced gesture of guardianship, and she took it the way she always had, and they walked into dinner. The problem was that it felt different. It had always felt like something he was managing, a thing he held carefully, at arm's length, conscious of the weight and the danger of it. Tonight it felt like he could not name it, like the last night of something, like the first night of something else, like standing at a threshold without knowing which direction he was facing. They talked through dinner the way they always talked, about the estate accounts, about the book she was reading, about the letter she had received from Lady Forsyth in Bath, inviting her to visit in March. He watched her hands as she spoke, the way she gestured when she was making a point she found obvious, the way she turned her wine glass in slow circles when she was thinking. He had watched those hands for 5 years. "You're quieter than usual," she said over the dessert course. "I'm often quiet." "You're often controlled," she corrected with the precision that had always undone him. "That's different from quiet. Tonight, you are actually quiet." He looked at her across the candlelight and said carefully, "It is a significant day." "For me," she agreed. "Less so for you, I would think." He said nothing. Something shifted in her expression, a small thing quickly covered. She looked down at her wine glass and turned it once in its slow circle. "I suppose you are relieved," she said, and her voice was perfectly even. "The obligation is discharged. 5 years is a considerable time to be responsible for someone else's inconvenience." The word hit him like a door swinging open in a storm. "Is that what you think you have been?" His voice came out lower than he intended. "An inconvenience?" She looked up, There was something careful in her eyes, something that had not been there at the top of the stairs. "I think I have been a responsibility," she said, "an honorable one, which you have discharged with characteristic thoroughness. I am not ungrateful, Ashford. I never have been." The use of his given name. She had always used it. They had established that informally in the first year. It had seemed strange to be called "my lord" by someone who lived in his house. Landed differently tonight. He did not know why. "You are not an inconvenience," he said. "No," she agreed, with a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am a completed obligation, which is better, I suppose." He should have let it go. He should have steered the conversation back to Lady Forsyth's invitation, to the spring garden, to anything that was safe and navigable, and did not require him to dismantle 5 years of careful architecture in the middle of a birthday dinner. "You are not that either," he said. The candles burned between them. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he watched her trying to read him, the thing she had always done, that patient, precise attention she brought to everything. And he watched her decide, as she usually decided, that she was misreading him. "Well," she said, and her voice was very light, "I am 21. I suppose that is something." "Yes," he said, "it is." He did not tell her what it was. He was not yet sure he was allowed to. She did not go to Bath. Lady Forsyth's letter was answered politely and declined, and Eliza remained at Ravenswood Hall through February, and the snow came, and the fires were kept high, and Ashford found himself in a new and bewildering country, with no map. The rules had been clear for 5 years. He was her guardian. She was his ward. The distance was not merely appropriate, but structurally necessary. It had been the load-bearing wall of his entire internal architecture, and now the wall was gone, not demolished, but simply dissolved on a Thursday over dinner and the tall silver candelabra, and he did not know how to stand in the space where it had been. She noticed. She was too perceptive not to notice, and she was too honest not to respond to what she noticed. And so the dynamic between them began, in small increments, to change. She came to the study in the mornings now, where she had previously confined herself to the library. She asked his opinion on things she had previously decided alone, not because she needed his guidance, he understood, but because she wanted his company. She sat across from him at the breakfast table and read her correspondence aloud, when something amused her, and he found himself listening for the shift in her voice that meant she was about to say something that would make him want to smile. He was not, he told himself, falling in love with her. He had been telling himself this for approximately 3 years. He was getting worse at believing it. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late February, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when he came downstairs for a glass of water and found her in the library. She was sitting on the floor in front of the fire, which had burned down to coals, her back against the settee, a book open in her lap that she was not reading. She was wearing a dark blue dressing gown, her hair loose and slightly disordered, and she had her knees drawn up and her chin resting on them, staring at the dying fire, with an expression he had never seen on her face in daylight. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He should have retreated. He stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain, and then she said, without turning her head, "I know it's you. You're the only person in this house who walks that quietly." He came in. He sat down in the armchair nearest the fire, which put him at an angle to her, close enough to see her face in the dim light. "What are you doing down here at 2 in the morning?" "Thinking," she said. "About?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What I am supposed to do now?" He did not speak. She turned her head and looked at him, and in the low light her eyes were very dark and very direct. "I have been here for 5 years," she said. "I arrived with a trunk and a copy of Virgil, and I had nowhere else to go. And you were very kind and very proper, and you gave me a home and an education and a season, and I am grateful for all of it." She paused. "But I am 21 now, and the season is over, and I have no particular desire to go to Bath. And I have been sitting here trying to determine whether staying is courage or cowardice." He said carefully, "Why would staying be cowardice?" She looked back at the fire. "Because it is easier," she said, "than going somewhere new and building something from nothing. Because this house is the only home I have known since I was 16. Because—" She stopped. "Because?" he said, and his voice was lower than he intended again. She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter." "It does," he said. "Tell me." She looked at him again, and there was something in her expression that he recognized, because he had been trying to keep it off his own face for 3 years. Something careful and exposed and afraid of itself. "Because I don't want to leave," she said very quietly. "And I'm not entirely sure the reason I don't want to leave is a sensible one." The fire crackled. The coals shifted. He should not say it. He had 5 years of practice at not saying it, 5 years of choosing silence over truth, and he reached for that silence now, found it, held it for exactly 4 seconds, and then set it down. "I have been counting," he said. She went very still. "Counting?" "The days." He looked at the fire because looking at her was not something he could manage while saying this. "Since approximately 3 years ago, I have been counting the days until the guardianship ended, and I told myself it was because the end of the guardianship meant resolution, clarity, that I would be able to breathe again once the obligation was discharged, and you were free to go wherever you chose." He paused. "I did not account for the possibility that you would not go." The silence stretched between them. He could feel her looking at him. "Ashford," she said. "I am aware," he said, still looking at the fire, "of how this sounds. I am aware of what I was to you and what the appropriate limits of that were, and I have maintained those limits, Eliza. I want you to know that. Everything I have felt I have kept where it belonged." "Where it belonged," she repeated, and her voice was strange. "Behind the wall," he said, "where it could not. Where it would not compromise you or your safety or your ability to make a free choice about your own life without the weight of my position influencing you." He finally looked at her. "You were 16 when you came here. You had no mother, no family, no one to protect you from a man who might have used your dependence against you. I was not going to be that man." She was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read. Her hands were very still in her lap. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he confirmed. "You spent 5 years." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "You walked me into every ballroom and stood at every correct distance and hired Mrs. Carver as my companion and arranged my season and introduced me to every eligible young man in the county." Her voice was not quite steady. "You were trying to give me away." "I was trying to give you a choice," he said. "There is a difference." "Is there?" She looked at him, and now her eyes were bright with something he was afraid to name. "Because from where I was standing, Ashford, it looked very much like a man who had decided what I wanted before I had the chance to tell him." He went still, I have been here for 5 years, she said, and her voice was very quiet and very clear, the way it always was when she was most certain of something. I reorganized your library. I have eaten breakfast across from you every morning. I know that you take your coffee without sugar, and that you read the agricultural reports before the political ones, and that you walk the east field when something is troubling you. She paused. I stayed in January. I stayed in February. I declined Lady Forsyth's invitation. I have been sitting on the floor of your library at 2 a.m, trying to find the courage to tell you that the reason I cannot imagine leaving is not because this house is comfortable. Her voice dropped. It is because you are in it. He looked at her for a long moment. The dying fire threw warm light across her face. Her hair was loose, and her expression was open in a way it almost never was, stripped of the careful social composure she had learned to wear. And he thought, this is who she has been, underneath, for 5 years. This is what I have been keeping myself from. He moved from the armchair to the floor, closing the distance between them, and when he reached for her hand, she gave it to him immediately, her fingers threading through his with the ease of something that had been waiting a long time to happen. I owe you an apology, he said very quietly. You owe me nothing, she said. I owe you 5 years of choices I made on your behalf without asking you what you wanted. He looked down at their joined hands. Someone should have asked you. I should have asked you. You were protecting me, she said. I was protecting myself, he said. The honor of it was real, but so was the cowardice. He looked up at her. I was afraid that if I let myself, that if I stopped counting and simply that you would leave anyway, that the feeling was entirely mine, and the distance was the only thing keeping it from becoming something that would damage you. She was quiet for a moment, then very softly, You are an extraordinary man, Ashford Pemberton, and a complete idiot. Something cracked open in his chest, something that had been sealed for 5 years. Yes, he said, I am becoming aware of that. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he stayed very still for a moment, absorbing the weight of it, the reality of it after years of imagining. And then he turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, and she made a small sound that undid him entirely. I am still afraid, he said into her hair. I want you to know that. I am not. This is not a man who has resolved his fears. This is a man who has decided his fears are less important than the truth. That is all I wanted, she said. Just the truth. He held her hand in the firelight until the coals went cold. Spring came to Ravenswood Hall with the particular violence of a season that has been suppressed too long. The gardens Eliza had planned in January came into color in April. The rose beds along the east wall, the kitchen garden she had expanded, the wisteria she had convinced the head gardener to train along the old stone wall that bordered the south lawn. Ashford walked those gardens every morning now, and she walked them with him, and the conversations they had in the early light were the ones he had been saving, without knowing it, for 5 years. There were complications, of course. There were always complications. His aunt, Lady Margrave, arrived in March with the particular energy of a woman who had heard rumors and intended to address them. She was 63, formidable, and had opinions about the appropriate behavior of dukes that she delivered without any softening whatsoever. You have been living in the same house as your ward for 5 years, she said over tea in the blue drawing room, while Eliza was in the garden and Ashford sat across from his aunt and reminded himself that she was family and he loved her. And now the wardship is ended, and she has not left, and you are walking in the garden together at 7 in the morning, and Mrs. Hartley tells me you have ordered flowers for the dining room every week since January." "Mrs. Hartley talks too much," Ashford said. "Mrs. Hartley is the only honest person in this house," his aunt said. "Ashford, what are your intentions?" "Honorable," he said. "They had better be considerably more specific than that." He looked at his aunt, who had known him since he was 8 years old, who had watched him become his father's son, and then slowly his own man, and he said, "I intend to ask her to marry me." His aunt was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does she know that?" "Not yet." "Does she want that?" He thought of the library at 2 in the morning, her hand in his, the weight of her head on his shoulder. "I believe so," he said. "Yes." His aunt set down her teacup. "There will be talk," she said. "You understand that. Guardian marrying his ward. There are people who will say things." "There are always people who say things," he said. "You will need to be prepared to face them." "I have been preparing for considerably more difficult things for 5 years," he said. "I think I can manage gossip." His aunt looked at him for a long moment, with the expression she had always worn when she was deciding whether to be proud of him. Then she picked up her teacup again. "Well," she said. "She reorganized the library, which needed doing. I will say that." He found Eliza in the rose garden, kneeling in the dirt beside the east wall with her gloves on, and a smear of soil on her cheek, examining the new growth on a climbing rose with the focused attention she brought to everything she cared about. She heard him coming and looked up, and the smile she gave him was the real one. "Your aunt is terrifying," she said. "She is," he agreed. He crouched down beside her, which put them at the same level, which was not something he had calculated, and was also, he was discovering, the only level at which he wanted to be with her. "She asked me my intentions." Eliza's hand stilled on the rose cane. "And what did you tell her?" "That they were honorable." He paused. "And specific." She looked at him. There was color in her face that was not entirely from the spring wind. "Eliza," he said, "I have spent 5 years counting days and maintaining distances and doing everything in my power to give you a free choice. I am asking you now, with no obligation between us and no walls left standing, whether you would like to stay." He held her gaze. "Not because this house is comfortable, not because you have nowhere else to go, because you want to be here, because you want to be here with me." She looked at him for a long moment, with that patient, precise attention that had always undone him. "I stayed in January," she said. "I know." "I stayed in February. I know." "I planned the spring garden in January," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very certain, "because I already knew I was going to be here to see it bloom." He reached out and took her face in his hands, soil-stained gloves and all, and she leaned into his palms with an ease that felt like 5 years of accumulated waiting, finally exhaling, and he kissed her in the rose garden with the spring sun on their backs and the wisteria beginning its slow climb along the old stone wall. They were married in June, in the small church at the edge of the Ravenswood estate, with his aunt in the front pew looking fierce and satisfied, and Mrs. Hartley crying quietly in the back, and the rose beds at full bloom along the path. He had written his own vows. He was not a man who did things by half measures, and he had decided somewhere around February that the traditional words were insufficient for the specific situation. "I have been your guardian," he said, holding her hands at the altar, "and I have failed at it in every way that matters, because a guardian keeps his ward safe and at a distance. and I have been unable to keep you at a distance since approximately the 3rd week of your arrival, when you reorganized my library without asking permission." There was quiet laughter from the pews. He did not look away from her. "I have loved you for 3 years and kept it behind a wall, because I believed that was what honor required. I am now of the opinion that honor requires something else entirely. The courage to say the true thing, to choose the real thing, even when the real thing is terrifying." He tightened his hands around hers. "I choose you, Eliza, not the ward, not the obligation. You, the woman who argues with me about agricultural policy and reads Virgil in Latin and plans gardens in January for springs she has already decided she will be present for. I choose you, and I intend to keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." She was crying, which she would later claim was entirely his fault, and her vows were shorter and more direct, which was characteristic of her. And they were, "I stayed. I was always going to stay. I just needed you to stop counting and start asking." 2 years later, on a January morning, Ashford came down to the library and found Eliza sitting in the armchair by the fire. The armchair, not the floor. She had graduated to the armchair. With a cup of tea balanced on her knee and a letter in her hand and their daughter asleep in the cradle beside her. 8 months old and already possessed of her mother's expression of focused assessment. He sat on the arm of the chair, which was not what the chair was designed for, and she leaned into him without looking up from her letter, and he looked at the fire and the sleeping child and the garden visible through the frost-edged window, the winter garden that was already, he knew, being planned for spring. "Tell me again," she said, which had become their ritual. "Not the full story, just the beginning of it." "You reorganized my library, Terho," he said, "without asking permission." "Without asking permission. And I stood in the doorway and thought, you thought you were in considerable trouble," she said. She had heard this part before. She always asked to hear it again. "I thought I was in considerable trouble," he confirmed. He pressed his lips to her hair. "I was right." She laughed quietly so as not to wake the baby and turned a page of her letter, and the fire burned warm and steady in the grate. And outside the January frost lay white, and still across the gardens she had already decided would bloom. Thank you for staying until the very end of their story. Ashford and Eliza began with 5 years of silence, of counted days and careful walls, and love kept precisely where it could not be seen. And they found their way to this, a January morning, a sleeping daughter, a fire that no longer needed to be managed. If this story gave you something, a held breath, a smile at an armchair that is not designed for two, I hope you'll subscribe and ring the bell, because there are more of these waiting for you. More impossible loves, more hard-won choices, more people who finally ask the right question. You are the reason these stories exist. Thank you for being here.